More than 4 billion years ago, the most important event in the history of the Earth took place. The ocean was born. It completely transformed the planet, creating a watery oasis that gave rise to the air we breathe, our climate, and a stunning array of life, including the critical species that first crawled out of the ocean to inhabit land.
We're looking at an animal that's really at the base of the branch in the tree of life that leads to all limbed animals, and we're a limbed animal.
The story of the ocean is the story of mass extinctions and of astonishing survival in one of the most beautiful and mysterious parts of the planet. Ultimately, the history of the ocean is our own history. And today, we are just beginning to understand its complexity and the immense influence it has on the planet and on our own survival. We live on a blue planet which is almost all ocean, a water planet that is unique among the cosmos. But where did all this water come from, and how did it transform our planet? Nick Isles, a professor of geology at the University of Toronto, has a good idea of what this planet looked like 4.5 billion years ago. He's traveling into the Afar Depression through Ethiopia's Rift Valley in the searing hot heat to descend inside Erta Ale, one of the planet's most active volcanoes.
Well, it's like a lot of things that you desire. They're sometimes difficult to get to, and this is typical of this place. It's quite a long way on the road, and then we've got a hell of a hike in, 45 degrees centigrade temperature up to the top of the volcano. But it's worth it. This is the best place to come and see Earth being born.
Professor Isles has come here to one of the hottest spots on the planet to better understand what early Earth must have looked like as it was being forged.
It formed out of dust particles, collecting together, brought together by gravity, meteorites bringing in more material, and it was a cluster. Think of it as a giant, red-hot snowball gathering material from space. It was a red planet. It wasn't a blue planet. There were no oceans, there were no atmosphere. It was a giant ball of red-hot magma flashing through space. You just look at that. That's incredible.
This is what remains from early Earth, a molten abyss where hot magma wells up from the Earth's core to form this lava lake. It's a window into the center of the Earth, a postcard of the planet from 4.5 billion years ago. There was no ocean, no land. Just this.
That's amazing.
A planet of lava, where gases belch up from deep within, and molten rock sloshes back and forth like water. So if the Earth started like this, How could an ocean ever have formed? And where did all the water come from?
Well, there's been a lot of scientific debate about the origin of the oceans, and surprisingly, the answer appears to be that the ocean water came from within the planet. It's water that was squeezed out under huge, unimaginable pressures from rocks and minerals. Imagine the forces that are taking place deep within the planet, and the water outgassed from the deep interior of the planet and pooled on the hot surface.
The water vapor entered the atmosphere as superheated steam. As it cooled, it condensed and rained down upon the planet, cooling the surface, ponding in the depressions, and slowly creating the first bodies of water, and eventually an ocean. The ocean reshaped the Earth's surface and ultimately transformed it into a livable temperate planet that could support life. Half of the oxygen we breathe comes from plants living in the ocean, and they absorb half of the carbon dioxide we produce. The ocean acts as the planet's thermostat. It regulates the temperature and prevents the Earth's surface from getting too hot or too cold. The ocean controls surface temperature through evaporation. As water evaporates off the ocean, it absorbs an enormous amount of heat. Without it, the Earth would be inhospitably hot, reaching temperatures of 60 or 70 degrees Celsius. Even if you live nowhere near the ocean, you still feel its immense influence. It drives the weather and climate patterns around the globe. In fact, a portion of the rain that falls on your lawn or garden has spent hundreds of years cycling through the ocean depths. As a geobiologist at the University of Hawaii, Eric Gaidos is interested in how the ocean affects the Earth's climate.
This water was and will be the ocean. Just a few days ago, it evaporated from the ocean. And now, after falling as rain in Kauai, this water is a mere few hours from completing its journey back to the sea. So the Earth's water is constantly in motion. In fact, 60 Amazons of water vapor constantly pass above our heads. Without that water, without the rain, all this life could not exist, and the land would be a desert.
The ocean not only shaped the Earth's surface and created our temperate climate, it nurtured life itself on this planet. When one single cell first formed some 3.5 billion years ago. Peter Ward, a paleontologist with the University of Washington, has traveled here to Shark Bay in Western Australia to see what that early life in the ocean might have looked like.
I really think this is a view of what the world looked like, all the world's oceans, from 3.5 billion years ago to 500 million years ago.
They may look like rocks, but these stromatolites are very much alive. They are made up of layer upon layer of tiny sticky bacteria. Sand and dirt particles adhere to the bacteria, building it up and giving it this rock-like appearance. These unique formations are a living record of how life on this planet first got started.
We geologists have our own pilgrimage, and every one of us sooner or later has to come right here. This is probably the most sacred spot on the planet for geology. It's a window back into time. There's nowhere else on Earth where you can see this, where you can really see what the planet was like, starting with the start of life itself, all the way up to almost 500 million years ago.
Stromatolites like these, here in Shark Bay, once covered the ancient ocean floor.
Every time we find fossils of marine rocks, there are stromatolites in them, but they're gone now. And the disappearance of them really can be thought of as perhaps one of the first and most disastrous of all mass extinctions for life.
So what happened to the ubiquitous stromatolites? What forces wiped them out? For billions of years, this planet was oxygen-free. The ocean was filled with anaerobic bacteria that thrived without oxygen, obtaining all their energy from rocks and minerals.
We can think of early life itself in ways somewhat analogous to energy in our society. I mean, right now we are fueled mostly by coal and oil, but we're switching to solar, aren't we? Well, early life was like that. Early life took its energy right out of rocks as we take it right out of oil wells. But very quickly, all that solar power, that untouched resource, became available simply through the evolution of one specialized type of cell, a pigment that could take sunlight, combine it with carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and build cell living material.
Stromatolites used these pigmented cells to harness the sun's energy. This reaction, called photosynthesis, released one revolutionary byproduct: oxygen.
The presence of oxygen was, in reality, just a mistake. It is a byproduct, simply a metabolic byproduct. It's not as if any plant really cares much about oxygen at all. They just toss it away during photosynthesis.
The oxygen emitted by stromatolites accumulated in the ocean and the atmosphere over hundreds of millions of years. Oxygen allowed more and more complex life to develop, eventually leading up to the ocean's earliest creatures.
The stromatolites around me were really the agents of their own destruction in a way. Animals themselves, newly evolved about 550 million years ago, could not photosynthesize, obviously. They're not plants, but they needed energy. They need food. Well, food is all around us. The most reliable food at that time were stromatolites. And so the early animals, which were capable of motion, had jaws, they had little rasping tongues if they were mollusks, and they just grazed. They grazed these stromatolites right out of existence.
Although today there is only a small sample remaining, it would be difficult to find a species of life that had a greater impact on this planet than these humble-looking stromatolites.
We animals, of course, would not be here without these stromatolites, or at least their great deep-time forebears. They gave us the oxygen atmosphere. Stromatolites made Earth an Earth-like planet. Charles Darwin recognized that all life on Earth today came from one first cell somewhere. Each of us is at the top of a great, rich tree. That family tree of ours has these stromatolites way down near its very base. We should revere these things. They did their job, if you want to say that, but certainly without them, we would not be here.
Life on this planet started in the ocean, and to this day, scientists are still discovering new species of life at every turn, and in some of the most extreme environments imaginable. Dr. Verena Tunnicliffe, an ocean biologist with the University of Victoria, has traveled to a part of this planet that few of us will ever get to see. A place where the energy of the sun doesn't reach, and where oxygen-hating bacteria still rule.
The first time our expedition discovered hydrothermal vents was actually the first time on the Juan de Fuca Ridge out off Canada, and that was about 25 years ago, and the feeling was just like walking into another world. I was in a manned submersible, so you're down under the ocean, nearly 2,000 meters, and it's a totally alien, quiet world that's crystal clear. go from black lavas into this vents with black smokers and animals all over the place. It's just like going into an oasis.
It may look lush and alive, but if there is a harsher place to live than a hydrothermal vent, it hasn't been found yet. Poisonous gas, searing hot water, heavy metals, extreme acidity, enormous underwater pressure. This seafloor ecosystem seems more like something from deep space than our own deep sea. Yet amazing communities of life have taken hold around these vents. Black smokers are powered by volcanoes, but that isn't smoke billowing out. It's hot, mineral-laced water. Water seeps down into the Earth's hot mantle through cracks on the ocean floor, where it gets superheated and starts to dissolve minerals and toxic heavy metals. The water, now heated to 400 degrees Celsius, boils back up through the sea floor. When the toxic mixture hits the frigid seawater, the dissolved minerals and heavy metals precipitate out, creating the billowing black plumes and building up these chimney-like structures. It's been 25 years, but Dr. Tunnicliffe is still fascinated with black smokers. Her team of engineers used this robotic submersible to dive down to the seafloor and study what is a very unique ecosystem.
You look at extreme conditions and you realize that where there's energy, there will always be life. And so we study the vents today. We see those adaptations of animals that can deal with fluctuating temperatures, or animals that have specific ways of getting oxygen out of the water, or animals that can deal with the big temperature gradients. And we see the adaptations. We see them in very different from anywhere else we look in the ocean, and thus have a window on the evolutionary process.
That life can exist under these conditions is amazing, but even more so when we consider that these creatures, the tube worm, clams, and crabs, are all sustained by one tiny bacterium that feeds off this toxic chemical stew.
So the hydrothermal vent ecosystem is an ecosystem that works on something called chemosynthesis, not photosynthesis like the rest of the planet does.
The chemical energy that powers this remote ecosystem is harnessed by anaerobic bacteria, similar to the first life in the ocean, who literally eat the dissolved rocks and minerals belching out of these vents.
So the fundamental grass in this system are microbes. That's the basis of the whole ecosystem.
These hardy microbes that survive on the fuel provided by the black smokers in turn attract a range of extraordinarily adapted creatures to this deep, dark site.
So the basic food source in the system is bacteria. And all of these animals have to figure out some way of getting that bacteria. There are some animals that have gotten to the point where, well, I don't want to spend all my energy, grazing bacteria. There's some crabs that grow the bacteria on their claws, and they put their front claws out into the water flow, and they sit there growing the bacteria like grass, and then they bring them in and they just lick their hands, and then they put them back out again.
An even more ingenious strategy of getting at those life-sustaining microbes is employed by the red tube worm.
They're very special to many biologists because they represent almost a pinnacle of the evolutionary process. A lowly, apparently lowly worm has done something that is quite extraordinary. It has no mouth, has no gut. Instead, it's taken microbes, bacteria from the environment, and inserted them in its body, and the bacteria do all the work in terms of making food for them.
Bacteria enter young, developing worms through an opening at the end of their tube. But as the worm matures, the openings in the tube close, trapping the bacteria inside.
And so this has become almost a poster child of adaptation, of how evolution has gone through to a very extreme limit. And when we look at these tube worms, we can understand many of these kinds of intriguing adaptations to very unusual conditions.
A harsh environment like this promotes adaptation. There is no easy way to make a living. For creatures to survive down here, they have to be creative.
It's really instructive to look at what we call extreme environments because you can begin to see the different solutions to problems that the environment throws at life on this planet. So looking at an environment like a hot vent, begin to realize that things that we consider are huge problems in our world have been solved by animals somewhere in the evolution of life. When we look at an ecosystem like the hydrothermal vents, we realize that life often can make the most of almost any setting. And so, given just the slightest chance, life is probably going to take it.
When it has to, life can adapt to extreme environments. But given a more forgiving and bountiful ecosystem, life explodes. Around 600 million years ago, multicellular animals started to take over the ocean. The first coral and sponge reefs provided the ideal home. The tight spaces and maze-like design feed and protect a multitude of species and offer a steady diet for the many predators. This is what a coral reef looks like from above. It's an inviting image of crystal clear blue water, teeming with life of every shape, size, and color. And this is what a coral reef looks like after it's been left out in the sun for over 400 million years. Professor Peter Ward has come to Western Australia to study this ancient reef and try to unlock the secrets it holds.
I've seen plenty of Devonian reefs, but every single Devonian reef I've ever seen has been subjected to millions of years of insult by the planet, tilted up or squished or turned into some other rock. The extraordinary aspect of this place, this reef lived and died and then was left completely alone by Mother Earth. It's as if somebody, the last person out, took the key and locked it up and said, "See you later," and off they went. This is the best preserved ancient coral reef of anywhere on the planet.
These razor-sharp formations are gravestones for what was once a global network of reefs. During the Devonian period, over 400 million years ago, barrier reefs built up in the shallow waters around the continents. On land, there wasn't much going on. There were no dinosaurs or amphibians yet. Even the plants had only recently left the water to try to establish themselves in the sun-baked soil. But in the ocean, it's an entirely different story.
We could go to the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, look at that clear water, examine those reefs, and we would have a very good picture of what it would have looked like. This is the so-called age of fishes because there were more fish of more different kinds, of unbelievable difference to what we have today. Biodiversity is enormous. The water would be crystal clear. We would see a wall, the wall would be covered with corals. But way more than that, there'd be archaic creatures now extinct. We're looking at a time before we had all the fish of today. These are archaic, they have big scales, they're clunky, they would kind of look like swimming tanks. But it would be so colorful, so diverse, so filled with life that we could compare it to the modern day reefs. I'm holding a piece of reef that came from this rock behind me. Every bit of white that you see in this hunk of rock was formed by an animal, not just an animal, thousands of species of animals, coral-like animals and true corals themselves, building skeletons, growing up into sunlight, making a giant coral city. Now look right behind that. The rocks turn black. The rocks above this, the younger rocks, have been taken over by something entirely different. It's no longer an animal reef, it's now a microbial reef. The animals are wiped out. What takes over was what was present on Earth before animals, microbes. It was one of the greatest mass extinctions in the history of the planet. This place is a graveyard, and we are just now beginning to understand what caused that. And personally, it scares the holy business out of me, because what caused that very much could happen again in our world.
Over 99.9% of species that ever lived on this planet are now extinct. They've come and they've gone. Over the past 540 million years, there have been 5 major extinctions, when over 50% of the planet's animal species were wiped out.
When I began my career, we thought that every one of the mass extinctions had been caused by a large body impact, a comet or an asteroid hitting the planet. It made great sense. Some huge rock the size of Mount Everest hitting the planet, throwing up dust, making the whole atmosphere dark. Sure, it would kill things. But over the last 10 years, that whole idea is beginning to change. We still think the dinosaurs were indeed killed off by a large asteroid hitting the planet. But there may have been as many as 14 other mass extinctions caused by something entirely different.
Professor Ward and many other paleontologists now believe that the extinctions weren't caused by a huge asteroid, but by a tiny bacterium.
The edge of this really stagnant river in Australia is a great place to illustrate what happened at the end of the Devonian. All over the edge of this, we find bacteria. This is blue-green algae, we call it, but it is a bacterium. It's here because there's almost no oxygen in this water because it's so hot. These things cover over whatever animals were present and suffocate them. Well, the same thing happened at the end of the Devonian with these coral reefs. The water got so warm it lost its oxygen. The microbes grew over the top of the corals and smothered them. Microbes which love hot, microbes which love dirty, oxygen-free water, microbes which use slime to build upon what the animals left behind.
These bacteria are anaerobic. Oxygen is like kryptonite to them. It kills them on contact. So if the ancient coral reefs were covered with oxygen-hating microbes, the ocean must have lost all of its oxygen. But how could that have happened? Oxygen gets mixed into the ocean by the churning action of waves, currents, and tides on the surface. But it's the great ocean conveyor that takes oxygen to the ocean's deepest depths. The conveyor moves surface water warmed at the equator toward the poles. As the water cools, it becomes denser and sinks to the deep ocean, taking life-sustaining oxygen with it.
How do we turn off the conveyor? We simply remove the difference in temperature between the poles and the tropics. We warm the poles, we keep the tropics the same temperature. That conveyor, which is driven by heat differences, stops. When it stops, we lose oxygen on the bottom, and we start the mechanism to mass extinction.
Once the conveyor shuts down and the ocean becomes stagnant, a deadly chain reaction is put in motion.
The reefs were in water that became warmer and warmer. Warm water holds less oxygen. The animals strangled and died. The microbes grew right over the top. Worse things then started to happen. In that warm water, not only did we get green microbes like this, but a second entire type began to grow, a microbe that produces the very toxic poison hydrogen sulfide. Hydrogen sulfide is a killer.
This lethal form of bacterium gets its energy by breaking down sulfur. However, in doing so, it creates hydrogen sulfide, a deadly byproduct.
These microbes began to take over not just the reefs, not just the shallow waters, but all the oceans. Huge bubbles of hydrogen sulfide come out of solution. They hit the surface, they pop out, they rise into the sky. In so doing, they poison the animals. They poison plants on land. They filled the atmosphere with toxic hydrogen sulfide. The bodies are stacked up on the beach or on the bottom of the ocean. But the ocean itself has changed entirely in its color. It's purple now. It's totally filled with purple sulfur bacteria. The sky takes on a vaguely greenish cast. A purple ocean, a green sky, a world without animals, a world replete, filled with microbes. That's the aftermath of a greenhouse mass extinction.
Scientists now believe that this catastrophic chain of events caused all but one of the 5 major extinctions.
Well, the mass extinctions, we now believe, were times when the evil empire, if you will, the first life on Earth, the microbial life, fights back. It makes a huge comeback. We animals think with our complexity we're here forever, but that's not the case. Environmental conditions are so narrow for we animals. Our conditions for temperature are narrow, for acidity, for the salt in the water, slight variation and we die. Microbes can take hotter temperatures, colder temperatures, greater acid, greater salt, less salt. In all ways, they're much more widely adapted and adaptable. Microbes will be the last life on this planet. And so the rock record really is this kind of uneasy back and forth between the animals and the microbes. Dominance by one group, mass extinction, dominance by another. This skating back and forth between these two very different kinds of life.
But are there certain traits that have allowed a few unique creatures to survive all the mass extinctions? Extinction is the fate of all species. However, there are creatures called living fossils that are somehow able to survive the constant onslaught of new predators and drastically changing conditions in the ocean.
Just like in any good army movie, there's always some survivors. You can't wipe out everybody. In the mass extinctions, not all the animals got wiped out. Obviously, here we are, surrounded by this animal-rich world.
Living fossils are just examples of the fact that once in a while evolution gets it supremely right early in the game. You never have to change anything.
But really, one of the most interesting areas of research is to figure out why. Why did some die, and why did some live?
To answer that question, Professor Peter Ward is going in search of one of the greatest survivors this planet has ever known, the Nautilus. It wasn't the biggest, or the deadliest, or even the fastest, and yet somehow it outlasted them all.
Here's an animal, 500 million years. I put my 500 million year old Nautilus up against any other animal on this planet. How do you survive
500,000 years. I mean, humans are only 200,000 years. 200,000, we're not a million. 500 million. They've got secrets. They know something. They're doing something right.
Well, and what have they got to teach us about surviving mass extinctions? So there could be some pretty important things to learn.
Professor Ward and Andy Dunstan from the University of Queensland have come to Osprey Reef to trap nautilus and study their unique adaptations for survival.
Okay, here you go, Pete. Got it. One piggyback trap.
Got it?
The traps will be lowered into the Coral Sea 150 meters down, the depth at which the nocturnal nautilus like to feed. During the day, the nautilus stay under cover, but as night approaches, they venture out onto the reef to feed. The nautilus can't see in the dark, but they use their tentacles to smell and track down their prey. Inside this rudimentary trap is a remarkably hardy species that managed to survive both the asteroid and the greenhouse extinctions. Professor Ward is interested in the adaptations that made the nautilus such a hardcore survivor.
I think this could be the smallest one we've ever caught.
God, I love these things. They're so beautiful. Thanks, evolution, for giving us nautiluses. Very good. All right.
The nautilus' flying saucer-like movement is a product of an ingenious adaptation. They breathe by passing water over their gills, which is then expelled through a narrow tube. When the nautilus wants to move up through the water column, it simply points the tube downward, and up it goes. It's the world's first jet propulsion system.
Yes, it's pumping water through there to let itself move around. But with that same energy, it is also putting water across its gills. It is respiring. Respiration has to be one of the most important drivers of evolution ever.
And this innovation is probably what allowed the nautilus to survive the greenhouse extinctions.
The mass extinctions are really times when oxygen levels in the ocean diminish. The creatures which seem to skate through best are those which can deal with this low oxygen level. They are pumping water at such high volume across their gills that even if that water has very few little oxygen molecules in there, by taking a huge volume, you're going to get them. While I'm swimming, I'm respiring. It's a beautiful system.
Hard to imagine today, but 500 million years ago, these humble-looking creatures ruled as the ocean's top predator. The nautilus used their mobility to silently stalk crab-like creatures called trilobites, attacking from above and snapping through their thin armor with their powerful jaws.
Evolution is very much like a war, and we could think of the nautiloids as the first airplanes coming in on ground troops. And so the ability of them to crunch through creatures that, with their armor, thought they were already impervious. No, these are like big tank busters. These things are coming in, swooping down, busting open these trilobites, and then eating the crew.
The nautilus is no longer the top predator on this reef. It's the shark, another living fossil that has defied the odds. Sharks have been around for at least 400 million years and have flourished in every part of the ocean. Like the nautilus, they respire while swimming and can survive low oxygen. Their slow cruising style uses very little energy and allows them to go a long time without eating. All good strategies for long-term survival. But it's their hydrodynamic, streamlined body design that gives them such a tactical advantage over all the other creatures in the ocean. All sharks have a pliable skeleton made from cartilage with no bones. It gives them strength without weight, and it helps that sharks will eat just about anything. During the mass extinctions, sharks fed off the dead species piling up on the ocean bottom. And when most of the fish were gone, well, there were always other sharks. This Nautilus is going to be fitted with a transmitter that will allow the scientists to monitor its every move along the reef.
With this particular transmitter, it will give us two very important bits of information. At any time, we can find out what depth he is at, and also his position.
And it's the depth where the Nautilus live and reproduce that is the key to understanding how they survived what the dinosaurs couldn't, a deadly asteroid impact.
The environmental impact of an asteroid or comet on the surface is that the surface of the sea really got fried and acidified.
If the Nautilus were living in the shallow ocean, they too would have been wiped out. But they weren't. They had already been chased away. After millions of years of being preyed upon by the Nautilus, the trilobites and early fish had evolved. They became the bigger, faster predators. The Nautilus was now under attack.
If they could, they would live at the surface. That's where they evolved. But they've been shoved down by the predators, shoved down by changing conditions in the ocean.
Ironically, those prehistoric predators saved the Nautilus from extinction when they pursued it into the depths.
There's this big asteroid collision. The surface oceans are wiped out. Deep down, 600 feet deep, the tiny little nautiluses are just biding their time. When they finally come up, the arthropods and the fish are all gone. So what we have is this one survivor of that one great catastrophe.
Professor Ward contends that ultimately, the Nautilus survival record is based on unique adaptations, good genes, and a measure of good luck. Luck which may now be running out.
They've gone through, therefore, every single one of the big 5 mass extinctions. They've gotten through greenhouse extinctions. They've gotten through asteroid extinctions. They've done it through a multiplicity of ways, and luck was certainly one of them. The real question now for a lot of these animals and plants is, yeah, they've gotten through the past, but will they get through the near future? And a lot of people say that we are in a 6th extinction. I don't know if we are or we are not, but the chances are that biodiversity is dropping and dropping fast right now. And so you ask, can these long-term survivors survive us?
Living fossils stopped evolving, while other species made incredible adaptations that would allow them to crawl out of the ocean and onto land. In 2004, Ted Deschler, a paleontologist with the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia, had the chance to travel back in time. Back to when the first creature crawled out of the ocean and onto land, or onto the mud, more precisely. It was up in the high Canadian Arctic where Ted uncovered a 375 million year old fossil. It was a missing link that reinforced Darwin's original theory that land-based animals originally came from the sea.
When we went up to Ellesmere Island, we first started to see it in our quarry, and we were first excavating and realizing we actually had found something. One of our colleagues saw two jaws start to emerge from the rock and called us over, and we all got very excited, because when you see two jaws coming together in articulation, as we say, then perhaps the whole skull is going to be there. And indeed, as we started to excavate a little further, we saw these two jaws, we saw a piece of a snout, and we knew that we found a complete skull with jaws, and if we were lucky, even more of the body. And that was the first big find of Tiktaalik. There were many of those eureka moments, but yeah, it's one of the reasons I'm in paleontology, is for those discovery moments. It's really exciting.
They dubbed the fossil Tiktaalik, or fishapod, half fish and half four-footed animal, the iconic creature that changed the Earth forever when it crawled out of the primordial ooze and onto land.
So when we look at Tiktaalik, we see an animal that has a lot of features of fish, but also many features of the earliest limbed animals. And that's what makes Tiktaalik very important. It shows us that transition between finned animals and limbed animals.
Ted has come to this coastal estuary here in Delaware Bay along the Atlantic Ocean to get a better idea of the natural environment where Tiktaalik first emerged.
One of the questions that always interests us is to understand the selective pressures that would have created animals like Tiktaalik. And the environments where we find the fossils are ancient settings, not unlike where I'm standing right now, the floodplains of streams, very muddy, lots of these sort of backwater settings. And these are places where it would have been a selective advantage to be able to move through shallow water, around plants, around stumps, and find your prey, and also to escape the larger predators.
Before Tiktaalik was able to transition out of the ocean, an incredible revolution had already begun on land.
When we look at the history of the Earth, 4+ billion years of time, the ocean has always been the cradle of life. It has conditions that are conducive to life, whereas land has always been a very, very harsh place, really until plants invaded the land about 400 million years ago. And once plants made that transition, it created an ecological niche that other animals then began to exploit. So if plants hadn't first made the transition to land, creating these sort of swampy wetland habitats, then vertebrates would never have made that transition either.
In Tiktaalik, we see the emergence of several physical characteristics for the first time, characteristics that would be incorporated by many subsequent species.
Looking at Tiktaalik, we're looking at an animal that's really at the base of the branch in the tree of life that leads to all limbed animals. And we're a limbed animal. In fact, there's many features of Tiktaalik that we see in all of the subsequent limbed animals, including ourselves.
Turn your head from side to side. This simple movement all started with this ancient creature. Tiktaalik is the first vertebrate to develop a free neck that allows the head to move independently of the shoulders, a good adaptation for catching prey in confined environments like a swamp. And there were other anatomical innovations that stuck. Tiktaalik developed mobility in its wrist joint. It could flex the wrist to propel itself forward, a physical trait that was passed down through all limbed animals, all the way to us.
It's important to realize that Tiktaalik was an animal that was developing features that were useful for survival in that environment, to catch prey and to escape predation. And then later on, as new ecological opportunities occurred, and we're talking millions and millions of years, descendants of Tiktaalik developed additional features that allowed them to exploit the land and eventually be free of the water completely. So what we see in Tiktaalik is an animal that was still primarily aquatic, but developing the features that would become useful in the future for animals that would exploit the land.
Each of us carries over 3.5 billion years of history inside of us. In every organ, cell, and gene in our bodies is a physical connection to the rest of life on our planet. To make sense of our own bodies, we need only to examine the evolutionary history we share with everything, from microbes to mammals.
When we look at our own bodies, we can see that we share an awful lot in common with our closest relatives, the great apes, and further down to amphibians and even fishes. And Tiktaalik is that connection to fishes. But we can go even deeper in the evolutionary tree, and we can see even more primitive forms and the innovations and the adaptations of those primitive forms for life in the oceans is something that we still carry with us. And so I think we really do have this deep, deep connection to our history, which started in the oceans. And it's here in our own bodies, we can see it, and it's in our psyche as well.